Picture a country where the busiest airport sits on the bottom of a drained lake, 4 meters below the level of the sea, where the lowest point of the land lies almost 7 meters beneath the waves. By every law of nature, this place should be part of the seafloor, and if the machines protecting it ever stopped, the water would come pouring back in a matter of days. And yet, on this impossible ground, nearly 18 million people live and thrive in one of the wealthiest nations on Earth. This is the Netherlands, a country that has been at war with the sea for 1,000 years and is still winning. The Dutch didn't find this land. They built it, dragged it up out of the water and mud with their bare hands, and then engineered the most sophisticated flood defense system the world has ever seen. Today we'll uncover how they did it, the night the sea broke through and killed nearly 2,000 people, and the strange recent decision that looks, at first, like surrender. Let's start with a land that was barely land at all, a land that had to be invented. The name says it plainly. Netherlands means the Low Countries, and that is the whole problem in a single word. This is a giant flat river delta, the place where great European rivers like the Rhine pour into the North Sea. For thousands of years, the rivers dumped silt and sand here, and thick layers of peat built up over swampy ground, creating a soggy, spongy, half-drowned landscape, a realm of marshes and tides that the sea flooded again and again whenever it pleased. When the Romans reached this place, they wrote about the people living here with a mix of amazement and pity. A miserable folk, they said, clinging to little handmade hills in the middle of the water, gathering their firewood from whatever the tide washed in. Those little handmade hills were the first stroke of Dutch genius. Unable to stop the floods, the people simply raised themselves above them, building artificial mounds of earth, basket of soil by basket of soil, and putting their homes, and eventually whole villages, on top. They're called terps, and hundreds of these ancient mounds still survive today, some still crowned with a farmhouse or a church. This was the opening move in the longest war in the country's history, a people versus the sea. Then, about 1,000 years ago, the Dutch stopped merely defending and went on the attack. Instead of hiding on mounds, they began to wall off entire sections of the wetland, throwing up the first dikes and dams, wringing a patch of soggy land, and then pumping the water out of it, at first using the power of the wind. Those iconic Dutch windmills you picture, turning against a flat sky, weren't just for grinding grain. Many were pumps, machines built to lift water up and out of the enclosed land, keeping it dry. A piece of drained, reclaimed land like this has a name, a polder. And over the centuries, the Dutch would create them by the thousands, quite literally manufacturing their own country, one drained field at a time. Which is exactly why they have an old saying, God created the world, but the Dutch created the Netherlands. Democracy born from a dike. But building dikes created a problem that turned out to change Dutch society forever. And this is a part of the story most people never hear. A dike protects everyone living behind it, which means if one landowner neglects his stretch of the wall and the water breaks through his section, it doesn't just flood him, it drowns all of his hard-working neighbors too. The sea, in other words, forced these people to cooperate, whether they liked each other or not. So, back in the Middle Ages, the Dutch invented something remarkable to manage it: elected water boards. These were councils, chosen by the community, that inspected the dikes, collected taxes to maintain them, and had the authority to force anyone, from the poorest farmer to the proudest nobleman, to do their duty in holding back the water. And here's the astonishing part. Those water boards still exist today. They are considered the oldest democratic institutions in the Netherlands, older than the Dutch national government itself. The Dutch still hold elections for them, right alongside their parliamentary elections, voting seriously for the people who will manage their dikes and their water. 1,000 years ago, the simple physical fact that a dike protects everyone equally quietly taught this nation how to govern itself by consensus. Their democracy, in a very real sense, grew out of the mud. The night the sea won. For centuries, the system held and grew, and the Dutch became more and more confident. And then came the night that shattered that confidence, and it's the reason everything you see in the Netherlands today exists. It was the night of January 31st, 1953. A ferocious storm was surging across the North Sea, and it arrived at the worst possible moment, colliding with a high spring tide. The water was driven higher and higher against the coast of the southwest, where the dikes, many of them old and neglected after the war, stood waiting. That night, while much of the country slept, the sea overwhelmed them. The dikes failed, not in one place, but in dozens, then scores of places at once. Nearly 100 major breaches tore open in the walls, and the freezing seawater roared into the low-lying polders where people were sleeping in their beds. By the time it was over, more than 1,800 people had drowned in the Netherlands, along with tens of thousands of animals. Around 200,000 hectares of land vanished under the water. Whole villages were destroyed. In one town alone, over 300 people died. A single young man lost 42 members of his own family in a matter of hours. It was the worst natural disaster the Netherlands had suffered in centuries. And in the chaos, there was one extraordinary act that captures the whole Dutch relationship with the water. In one town, as a critical dike began to collapse and threatened to flood a deep polder full of people, the mayor made a desperate gamble. He commandeered a river ship, a vessel called the Two Brothers, and ordered its captain to do something insane: to deliberately drive his own ship straight into the gap in the breaking dike and plug the hole with it. The captain did it. The ship wedged into the breach, held back the flood, and saved countless lives. That is the real Dutch spirit. Not a legend, but a captain ramming his ship into a wall of water to save his neighbors. The Delta Works, the wonder built from grief. The nation's grief hardened into an iron resolve: never again. Within just 20 days of that terrible flood, the Dutch government assembled a committee and gave it a monumental task: to make sure the sea could never do this again. What they produced became known as the Delta Works, and it is, quite simply, one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history. So vast and so ambitious that it has been named one of the 7 wonders of the modern world. The plan was audacious. Rather than just building every existing dike higher forever, the engineers decided to shorten the coastline itself, to seal off the vulnerable estuaries and inlets of the southwest with a network of enormous dams, sluices, and movable storm surge barriers. It took nearly 40 years to complete, from the 1950s all the way to 1997. And the crown jewel of the entire system is a structure so large it is difficult to believe it's real: the Maaslandkering, a colossal moving sea gate built to guard the approach to Rotterdam, the largest port in Europe. Try to picture this. The Maaslandkering is a pair of gigantic curved steel arms that normally rest open on either bank of a waterway, letting the world's ships sail freely in and out of the port. But when a killer storm surge is predicted, the arms swing shut, meeting in the middle and then sinking down to form a solid wall against the sea. Each of those 2 arms is about as long as the Eiffel Tower is tall, and together they weigh roughly 4 times as much as the Eiffel Tower. It is one of the largest moving structures ever built by human beings. And the most Dutch detail of all, it operates fully automatically. When the computers predict the sea will rise high enough to threaten the city, the barrier decides, on its own, to close, a machine the size of a monument, standing guard, that shuts its own gates against the ocean while the people of Rotterdam sleep. 2 myths drowned. Now let's clear away 2 famous myths, because the truth is better than the legend. First, the story everyone thinks they know. The little Dutch boy who saw a leak in a dike, plugged the hole with his finger, and stood there all night, saving his country. It's charming. It's also completely foreign to the Dutch themselves, because they never told this story. The boy with his finger in the dike was invented by an American writer in the 19th century in a children's novel. The tale spread across the world, and generations of foreign schoolchildren grew up believing it was ancient Dutch folklore. Tourists kept arriving and asking to see the statue of the heroic boy, until the practical Dutch finally gave up and built a few statues purely for the visitors. A myth invented across an ocean, made real in bronze in a country it never belonged to. And the irony is that it's engineering nonsense. If a dike springs a real leak, a finger won't save it. The escaping water widens the hole every second. The second myth, that Amsterdam floats on the water like Venice. It doesn't. Amsterdam stands on stilts, millions of wooden and now concrete piles driven down through the soft ground to a firm layer of sand far below. The entire old city rests on these hidden pillars. The royal palace alone sits on more than 13,000 of them. There's a Dutch joke that Amsterdam is built on the bones of herring, meaning the fortune that paid for all those piles and canals was earned from the fish trade. The real heroes of this country were never magic boys. They were thousands of nameless builders, dike keepers, and engineers doing their patient, unglamorous work century after century, making peace with the water. So the story seems to end in triumph. The land secured, the wonders standing guard, the sea defeated. But in the last few decades, the Dutch have done something no one expected, something that sounds, at first, like giving up. They have started giving land back to the water. And it isn't surrender. It's the coldest, smartest calculation they've ever made. Here's the logic. Climate change is raising the sea and making storms and river floods more violent. And the engineers realized a hard truth. You cannot simply build the walls higher forever. Because the higher the wall, the more catastrophic it is when it finally fails. So a new philosophy was born, not to fight the water, but to negotiate with it. Under a program called Room for the River, the Dutch deliberately moved dikes back, inland, in dozens of places, and handed floodplains back to the rivers, giving the water somewhere to spread safely during a flood instead of drowning a city. To do this, the government had to buy out farms and relocate families who had lived on that land for generations. Painful, wrenching decisions. But the logic is simple. Better to sacrifice a field on purpose now than to lose a city by accident later. And they've become astonishingly clever about it. In Rotterdam, they build public squares and parks that are designed to transform into water reservoirs during a downpour. They've built entire neighborhoods of floating houses, anchored to sliding poles, that simply rise up with the flood and settle back down when it passes. A resident's only clue that they live on water is a private dock instead of a front garden. And in one beautifully elegant project called the Sand Motor, instead of constantly dredging sand to rebuild eroding beaches, engineers dumped one enormous artificial peninsula of sand off the coast and let the natural currents slowly spread it along the shoreline for years, letting the sea itself do the maintenance work for free. A country that fought the ocean for 1,000 years is now learning to put the ocean to work. So how does a nation live below the sea and refuse to drown? Not with a single wall or a single miracle, but with 1,000 years of stubbornness, cooperation, and genius. Turps and windmills, waterboards and dikes. The grief of 1953 turned into the wonder of the Delta Works, and now a graceful new peace with the water itself. Everything you see there is the result of a people who were handed one of the worst possible places to build a country, and simply refused to accept it. And there's a deeper lesson in all of it, one the whole world is starting to notice. As seas rise everywhere, coastal cities from New York to Jakarta to Venice now face the exact problem the Dutch have been solving for a millennium. And so, when those cities look for answers, they make the same phone call to the Netherlands. Dutch engineers now design flood defenses across the planet because no one on Earth understands living with water like they do. The country that had to invent its own ground has become the world's teacher for the age of rising seas. But the Dutch themselves have no illusions. They know precisely what they are. If every pump and barrier ever switched off, the engineers have calculated it exactly. The lowlands would begin flooding within days, and within a few years, the map of the country would roll back 1,000 years, and the sea would reclaim everything it was ever lent. The Netherlands is, in the end, like a bicycle. It only stays upright as long as it keeps moving. And for 1,000 years, this remarkable nation has never once been willing to stop pedaling. So tell me, had you ever realized just how much of the Netherlands is a human creation? And I'm always curious how far these stories travel, so let me know what part of the world you're watching from. The sea is patient, but so, it turns out, are the Dutch. See you next time.